In this video, I'll show you how to paper piece this flying geese block with triangles. The finished size for this pattern is a 3-inch square, but you can use this same technique to make these smaller group of flying geese or to make sections of larger blocks. There are many different ways to tackle this paper piecing pattern. This is my preferred method. Before you start, you want to download this pattern from learnhowtoquilt.com. You'll find it in the Beginner Basics under Paper Piecing. I've cut this pattern out along the dashed lines. These solid lines are the sew lines. The numbers on my pattern show the order in which to sew my fabric pieces. Here's a list of steps that I'll be following. First, you want to make sure that your fabric has always been pressed before you begin. Then you want to fold the lines on your pattern between 1 and 2. I like to use a postcard or an old card to do this. So I just place that card down to fold that line. Every time I fold the paper, the fibers are weakened. Later on, this will make it easier to pull the paper off. I also find that this helps with fabric positioning and trimming seams. Sometimes I fold all the lines first, as I find it easier to do this all at once. Here's my fabric number 1. It has to be big enough to cover this space, and it has to cover this outside seam allowance here. So I see that this more than covers that. I could use this whole piece of fabric, but I think it's better to cut it down to a smaller piece. When working with triangles, I like to start with a rectangular shape. So I can see that this is going to be more than enough. Just let me use my scissors. When you're sewing on paper piece patterns, the fabric always goes on the back over that number. So I'll put the fabric on the back, and I like to pin this and then hold it up to the light to make sure it's covered. But we can see that that's going to cover that space with more than enough room. My first line that I'm going to sew is between 1 and 2. So I'd like to fold down that pattern and then trim. I eyeball about a 1/4 inch seam. If it's a little smaller, that's okay, or a little larger, that's okay. Some people don't trim at all, but I find it easiest to trim first. So for fabric number 2, I'll also cut a rectangle. Let me turn this over. Here's number 2. Here's my fabric. Let me put that over the top, and let's just cut this. Doesn't have to be perfect. I just need to make sure that this fabric will cover number 2, but it goes on the back. So I like to put my finger on number 2 while turning the pattern over so I know where to place the fabric. Fabric number 2 goes right here. When we sew, we're usually putting right sides together. This is also how we sew when we're paper piecing. I can't move fabric number 1 because it's pinned, but I can move fabric number 2 to put right sides together. I'll line it up with that cut line. I could flip the pattern over and begin sewing right now, but I like to check to make sure that everything's in the right place. And I do that by pinning on this sew line. So let me turn the pattern over and let me flip it back. So after I've sewn, my fabric will come back looking like this, and let me make sure that fabric has covered this line, and I can see that's more than enough, that it's covered over here. I also want to make sure it covers down in this corner. So to sew, I'm using red thread so you can see better. Usually I like to use a neutral color thread like this. A larger needle will help you perforate your patterns and make it easier to tear off, but it's not necessary. You can also use a shorter stitch length to help with this perforation. When I start sewing, I come in beyond this dashed line. Some people like to draw a line from the solid line to the edge, but I either eyeball it or sometimes I can follow that fold line. Let me put that there. I take the pin out. Got the right sides together here, and I'm ready to sew. When I stitch, I just want to stitch on the black line. Just follow that black line as best I can. And when I come to the end of that black line, I'm going to cross this other black line. I'll add 1 to 2 stitches. I don't have to back stitch. And then I'll take my piece out and clip those. And this is what my piece looks like. I'll take this over to the ironing board and press. Now that I've sewn 1 and 2 together, I'm ready for fabric number 3. My fabric number 3 is going to go right there. By the way, I'm down here, fold the line between number 2 and 3, and repeat from 5 above. So I'm going to come back here, and I notice that it says I need to fold the paper back, fold this back, and trim. So I'm going to eyeball that 1/4 inch seam, and got something that looks like this. I've cut my fabric big enough to go over the top of that. It's going to go right here. Keep my finger there, turn it over, and I see fabric number 3 will go there. It's going to look like this, or something like this. But when I sew, I have to put right sides together. This fabric's sewn in place and I can't move it. So I'll flip this back, line it up along the edge here, and pin. And the reason why I'm doing that is that's sort of a basting stitch, so I can make sure that I've got this positioned properly. If I hold it up to light, I can see down in the corner here that that fabric is big enough to cover, and that fabric comes all the way past up here. So I want to make sure that that piece covers that area, and it's more than enough. I'll flip it back. And now I'm ready to sew. This time I'm going to start from up here in the center of the pattern. There's no rule about whether you start here or here, but I just want to show you what that looks like. I will start sewing 1 to 2 stitches before that solid line. I can take a pencil and draw that out, or I'm just going to eyeball it. I don't lock my stitches, I just come forward and I stay on that black line. I don't stop at the end of the black line. I have to stitch all the way through into this corner. I want to go past those dashed lines, or at least up to those dashed lines. Flip those threads, flip that back, and that's what your piece will look like up to this point. Take this over to the iron, or I can finger press this. So most of your paper piecing patterns are kind of small, and you can get away with finger pressing them. Now I'm going up to fabric number 4. The first thing that I need to do is fold the line between, well, now it's 3 and 4, so I'm going to fold this line. You'll notice that the stitches are kind of getting hung up in here. Don't worry about it. You're going to sew over the top of those and catch. But when I fold that down, that's going to help me trim. Eyeball 1/4 inch and trim across. That's not such a great 1/4 inch, but it'll do. Doesn't have to be perfect. Fold that back. I've cut my piece of fabric. Fabric number 4, this rectangle, more than enough covers that. Fabric number 4 goes right here. When I sew, I have to put right sides together. I can't move these fabrics, so this must be the one that has to flip down. I like to come in and use my pin, sort of a basting line. And when I flip it back, what's it going to look like? Well, I can see that it's going to more than enough cover everything. So I'm ready to take this to the sewing machine. I don't want to start right on this black line. I want to start out past the dash line. Trim these threads, and I'll pull that back. You have a nice place where the points meet. That looks good. Take this over to the ironing board and press. I'm going to fold down 5, and see, this stitching's not going to make it, it's going to be too hard to fold properly, but I'll just fold it as best I can, because I'm really just using that to give me an idea of where to cut this line. And when I get up here, I'm just going to kind of turn that to the side and there. Now I'm ready to take fabric number 5. Let me put my finger here on 5. I'm going to turn it over, and now I'm going to flip fabric number 5 down, and let's see, let's say that I flip it, let's do it like this. I flip it down, put my pin in on the sew line, and I move this back. I look at this, and I can take my flashlight, and I see that that green fabric is not covering all the way up to this point. That happens sometimes. So I know that I'm going to have to reposition this and move it in that direction. So let me take this out. I'm moving it in that direction. I see that I have more than enough up there. Sometimes with triangles though, it's tricky. You think you have more than enough, and then you find out, no, that's not true. Pin this back in, and I'll flip that over. I don't think we need the light because I can see that that's going to be more than enough. I'll begin sewing, coming on the outside edge of that dash line. I sew straight in to this solid line. Some people like to mark that, but I can eyeball it. You really want to make sure that you come in right on that line though, to make sure all your points will be in the right spot. When I sew all the way up to the top. Fold that back. I can finger press it or take it over to the iron. I'm ready for my next piece. Fold this. Oh, it's really hard to fold down now. So maybe I'll just go with this. Here's where my piece is going to go. I flip it, take it over to the sewing machine. I'm not going to use a pin now because I have done this a number of times and I pretty much know where that belongs. So here we go. I want to make sure that I'm going to hit this solid line. I'm going to cross right over on that red line, right in that corner, so I get a nice neat point. Now I'm ready to trim the excess. So let me turn it over. I want to trim on these dashed lines. Sometimes I'll stitch a line between the dashed line and the solid line to keep these pieces from flapping, but that's not necessary. Let me show you what that looks like. I'm between the solid line and the dashed line. This is a stitching line that nobody's going to see. It's just helping to keep that fabric down. When I'm trimming this, the fabric sort of stays in place, makes it a little bit easier to trim, as opposed to this side, the fabric's flapping and sometimes it makes it more difficult to trim. So let me trim this up and show you what my completed piece looks like. Here's my completed block. That stitching won't show because it's sewn into the seam allowance. Let me turn it over. If I was to use this for a card, I can leave the paper in, but if I want to put it in another quilt, I need to take the paper out. So you just reach in and start tearing the paper out like that.